بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
You have heard them 1,000 times. Islam is a complete deen. Sharia is the law. We must prioritize deen over dunya. These phrases circulate in sermons, on social media, in living rooms and lecture halls across the Muslim world. And you have seen the strange contradiction that follows. When people speak of deen over dunya, the tone is one of spiritual aspiration, of rising above materialism, of anchoring the heart in something eternal. But the moment the word Sharia enters the same conversation, the atmosphere shifts entirely. Suddenly, the discussion turns to punishment, fear, and oppression. For many inside the faith, Sharia triggers defensiveness. For many outside it, the word evokes nothing but dread. But here is a question that almost never gets asked, and the answer might completely reshape how you understand Islam. What is the actual difference between Deen and Sharia? Most Muslims use these words interchangeably, or use one when they mean the other. Most non-Muslims have never encountered the word Deen at all. They know only Sharia, and what they know is filtered through years of headlines about punishment. But the two words are not the same. And confusing them has contributed to some of the deepest misunderstandings in modern Islamic thought, misunderstandings that affect how Muslims practice their faith and how the world perceives them. In the Quran and in the life of the Prophet, these were never two separate things. They were one unified system, presented together, lived together, impossible to disentangle without doing damage to both. Today, we bridge the gap between the complete way of life and the path of law. The Arabic word deen appears in the Quran nearly 100 times. But its meaning is far richer and more multidimensional than any single English translation can capture. Linguistically, deen carries several interconnected layers of meaning, obedience and submission, as in the relationship of a servant to a master, judgment and recompense, as in Yawm al-Din, the day of judgment, when every soul will receive what it has earned, a path or way, a complete and coherent system of beliefs and practices that organizes a life, and a debt or obligation, something that is owed, something that has a claim upon you. When the Quran declares, in Surah Al-Imran, verse 19, indeed, the deen with Allah is Islam, it is not making a narrow, doctrinal point about religious labels. It is saying that the complete, divinely ordained way of life, encompassing belief, worship, ethics, law, personal conduct, social relations, and even the organization of governance, is Islam. Islam means submission, submission to Allah in its fullest, most all-encompassing sense. Deen is holistic in a way that has no real equivalent in the Western concept of religion. It includes Aqeedah, the creed, what you believe about Allah, about the prophets, about the angels, about the decree of Allah, about the day of judgment, about life after death. This is the foundational layer, the lens through which everything else is understood. Ibadah, worship, the 5 daily prayers, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, and every act of devotion that connects the human being to the divine. This is the heartbeat of the Muslim life. Akhlaq, ethics, honesty, compassion, justice, patience, humility, generosity, forgiveness. These are not optional extras bolted onto the faith. They are central to it. Muamlat, transactions and relations, how business is conducted, how marriages are contracted, how inheritance is distributed, how contracts are honored. The faith extends into the marketplace and the household. Governance, how communities are led, the principles of justice, consultation, accountability, and protection of the vulnerable that should characterize Islamic political life. Personal lifestyle, what you eat, how you dress, how you speak, how you treat those around you. Even the seemingly small choices of daily life fall within the circle of deen. In short, deen is everything. There is no sacred secular divide in classical Islamic thought, no area of existence that falls outside the scope of a Muslim's relationship with Allah. The Quran does not speak of religion as one department of life alongside work, family, and politics. It speaks of a complete way of being. The Prophet Muhammad, the one who embodied and transmitted this deen most completely, gave us two descriptions that reveal exactly what deen is and what it is not. He said, "I was sent to perfect good character." That single statement is revolutionary. It tells us that the Prophet did not come primarily to deliver a legal code or a set of ritual instructions. He came to complete and perfect something already present in the moral intuitions of humanity, good character. Deen, at its deepest level, is about becoming a certain kind of human being. He also said, the deen is sincerity. Deen is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically, performed for social approval, or discharged out of fear of community judgment. It is a living relationship of sincere counsel and sincerity, with Allah, with His book, with His Prophet, and with the community of believers. When that sincerity is present, deen is alive. When it is absent, even perfect outward compliance becomes hollow. As explored in our previous discussion, Shari'ah literally means the path to water, the path to survival, sustenance, and life. In Islamic usage, it refers to the divinely revealed rulings that govern specific actions, what is obligatory, what is forbidden, what is recommended, what is disliked, and what is permissible. But here is the critical point that resolves so much confusion. Shari'ah is a part of deen. It is not the whole of deen. Think of deen as a circle. Inside that circle are four broad domains: theology, what you believe; spirituality, how you purify and develop your inner life; ethics, how you treat other beings; and law, what you may and may not do. Shari'ah occupies primarily the legal domain. It is the specific body of divine commands and prohibitions that scholars have extracted and systematized from the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, what does Shari'ah covers, and what it does not? Classical scholars divided the content of Shari'ah into two broad categories. The first is Ibadat, ritual worship, which includes the specific rulings governing prayer, fasting, zakat, and pilgrimage. These are primarily between the individual and Allah, but they have detailed rules attached to them: when to pray, how many units, what conditions must be met, what breaks the fast. These rulings belong to Shari'ah. The second is Mu'amalat, human transactions, which includes marriage, divorce, inheritance, contracts, commerce, evidence, and the resolution of disputes between people. These require courts, judges, and a framework of legal enforcement. These two belong to Shari'ah. But notice something important: Shari'ah does not micromanage every detail of existence. It does not tell you what to eat for breakfast beyond the general categories of lawful and unlawful. It does not tell you which career to pursue, which hobbies to adopt, or what your aesthetic preferences should be. Those things fall under the broader umbrella of deen, shaped and informed by Islamic values and ethics, but they are not fixed by specific legal rulings. The vast texture of a Muslim's daily life is guided by the spirit of deen, informed by Shari'ah's principles, but not dictated by it in every particular. So if deen is the complete way of life, Shari'ah is the legal framework that governs specific actions, particularly those that affect other people, those that have been explicitly ruled upon in the primary sources, or those whose neglect would undermine the fundamental objectives of the faith. If the distinction seems clear, why do so many people, including many Muslims, use the words interchangeably? The answer lies in history, politics, and the mechanics of how meaning is lost when language is stripped of its context. First is the colonial reduction. European colonial powers, when they occupied Muslim lands, deliberately reduced Islam to law so that they could administer, control, and ultimately reshape it. They created Anglo-Muhammadan law in India, Droit Musliman in Algeria, comparable constructs in Indonesia and elsewhere, legal codes that stripped Islam of its spiritual, ethical, and civilizational dimensions and presented it as nothing more than a set of rules to be administered by colonial courts. In doing so, they performed a profound act of conceptual violence. They took a complete way of life and amputated from it everything that could not be codified, administered, and controlled. The result was a hollowed-out version of Sharia, one that looked like Islamic law but had been severed from the Deen that gave it meaning and direction. When the colonial period ended, many Muslim countries inherited this reductionist framework. Sharia became something you studied in a law school, not something that shaped your entire existence. The rich spiritual, ethical, and communal dimensions of Deen became afterthoughts, or were addressed in separate, equally marginalized, religious institutions. Second is the modern state's co-optation. Modern nation-states in the Muslim world have further narrowed the concept. They created ministries of religious affairs, appointed state muftis, designed official school curricula, and in every case, the effect was to treat Sharia as a branch of legal administration, divorced from the personal, spiritual, and ethical dimensions of Deen that classical scholars always understood as inseparable from it. The average Muslim today frequently learns about Sharia as a checklist of halal and haram, a list of what is permitted and what is not, without encountering the deeper objectives that those rulings were designed to serve, and without experiencing the spiritual context that gives those rulings their inner meaning. As a result, Deen shrinks to Sharia, and Sharia shrinks to a checklist. And a checklist, however carefully followed, is not a way of life. Third factor is the media's obsession with punishment. When Western media covers Sharia, its focus falls almost exclusively on the hudud, the handful of specified criminal punishments. This small category, representing perhaps 2% of the entire classical tradition's output, is presented as though it were the whole. The laws governing marriage and protecting women's rights, the inheritance rules that distributed wealth across families, the contract law that made fair trade possible, the evidentiary standards that protected the accused, the ethical injunctions to feed the poor, care for the sick, and forgive those who wrong you, none of these appear in the headlines. The result is that Sharia is presented as nothing but its harshest conceivable face. And since Sharia is, wrongly, equated with the whole of Islam, the casual reader concludes that Islam itself is harsh and brutal. This is not ignorance alone. It is a distortion with a long political history and very specific consequences. Fourth reason is Muslim activists who overcorrect. In response to these reductions and distortions, some Muslim voices have begun emphasizing Deen over Dunya, recovering the spiritual and ethical depth of Islamic life that has been flattened by both the colonial reduction and the media's obsession with law. This is a necessary correction, but it sometimes introduces a new confusion of its own, when those same voices say, follow the Deen, while actually meaning, follow a particular set of legal rulings, or when they speak as though Deen and Sharia were entirely separate concerns. The correction is needed, but the language must be precise if it is to help rather than add to the confusion. You have seen the hashtags, you have heard the speeches. Deen over Dunya. Don't let the world distract you from your religion. This life is temporary, the hereafter is eternal. At its core, this is a call to prioritize the spiritual and eternal over the material and fleeting, and it has a strong and unambiguous foundation in both the Quran and the Sunnah. Allah says, "And the life of this world is nothing but play and amusement, while the abode of the hereafter, that is the real life, if only they knew. And seek, through what Allah has given you, the home of the hereafter, but do not forget your share of this world." The Prophet said, be in this world as if you were a stranger or a traveler passing through. The sentiment is authentic, deeply Quranic, and essential. The world is real, but it is not ultimate. The believer lives in it fully without being enslaved to it. The problem arises when the slogan is pushed beyond what the tradition actually teaches. Some voices take Deen over Dunya to mean avoid education because that is the world. Avoid wealth because that is the world. Avoid politics because that is worldly. Avoid science, art, culture, all of it is dunya. But this is a profound misreading of both the Quran and the prophetic example. Allah explicitly commands, seek, through what Allah has given you, the home of the hereafter, but do not forget your share of this world. The Quran does not call for the abandonment of the world, it calls for a particular relationship with it. And the Prophet himself? He was a trader who conducted commerce with honesty and skill. He was a husband and father who fulfilled the most intimate human relationships with tenderness. He was a political leader who negotiated treaties and managed communities. He was a military commander who made strategic decisions under pressure. He engaged the entire world, but his heart was anchored in Allah, and his engagement with the world was always an expression of his service to Allah rather than a distraction from it. True, Deen over Dunya means prioritizing the values, objectives, and commitments of Deen while participating fully in the world, not because the world is irrelevant, but because the way you engage with it is itself an act of worship. It means refusing to sell your faith for worldly gain. It does not mean hiding from the world, being ignorant of it, or treating every form of worldly engagement as spiritually suspect. When the slogan is used to justify ignorance, passivity, or withdrawal from civic and intellectual life, it becomes not an expression of the prophetic model but a distortion of it. What we are living through today is the simultaneous operation of two parallel reductions of Islam, each feeding the other in a cycle that distorts the tradition from two different directions. First is the external reduction: non-Muslims, and some Muslims, reduce Sharia to its criminal provisions. The conversation never reaches the laws of marriage and divorce that were designed to protect women's rights and dignity in societies where they had none. It never reaches the inheritance system that distributes wealth across entire families rather than concentrating it in the hands of the eldest son. And it never reaches the contract law that made long-distance trade fair and transparent. It never reaches the laws of evidence that require rigorous proof before any punishment could be applied. Also, it never reaches the ethical commandments to feed the poor, visit the sick, forgive enemies, and treat even animals with mercy. By reducing Sharia to its harshest conceivable face, the external critique turns it into a monster, a caricature that bears little resemblance to the living tradition that shaped civilizations for 14 centuries. Second is the internal reduction. At the same time, many Muslims, particularly in Western contexts, have begun marketing Deen as pure spirituality. They speak of love, peace, mindfulness, personal growth, and the inner dimensions of faith. They consciously avoid discussing Sharia because it feels politically difficult or culturally inconvenient. This produces what might be called a comfortable Islam, one that is palatable to modern sensibilities, that makes no demands that could cause conflict, that requires nothing of anyone that their surrounding culture does not also require. But it is incomplete. The Prophet did not come only to teach inner spirituality. He came to establish justice in human society, to restrain harmful conduct, to create systems that protect the weak from the strong, and to build communities where accountability was real. That requires law, that requires structure. That requires, in short, something like Sharia. The result and the authentic alternative, we end up with two Islams that cannot recognize each other: the fearful Islam, all law, all punishment, no mercy, no heart, and the comfortable Islam, all spirituality, all feeling, no structure, no consequence. Neither is authentic. The authentic Islam that the Prophet brought and embodied integrates both dimensions inseparably. The legal and the spiritual. The outward and the inward. The fear of Allah and the love of Allah. The structure that makes a community possible and the spirit that makes that community worth having. The tradition has always known that you cannot separate these without doing violence to the whole. This is a sharp question. If Sharia is part of Deen, then rejecting Sharia would mean rejecting part of the Deen, which could be a form of disbelief, kufr. A sharp question that requires careful thinking and must be precise about what rejecting Sharia actually means, because the phrase covers very different things. Rejecting the divine origin of clear commands, if a Muslim says, the rulings that Allah revealed in the Quran and the authentic Sunnah, the obligation of prayer, the prohibition of murder, the commands of justice, are not binding on me, that person is rejecting a core element of the Deen. This is a serious matter, regardless of what reasons are given. Rejecting a particular scholar's interpretation, if a Muslim says, I do not accept the Hanafi ruling on this specific matter because I find the Maliki position more convincing and better grounded in the sources, that is not a rejection of Sharia. That is the exercise of ijtihad, or the legitimate following of a different and equally valid school of thought. The diversity of the legal schools exists precisely because this kind of disagreement is considered legitimate and even productive. Rejecting a state's implementation, if a Muslim says, the way that Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Afghanistan under the Taliban implements what it calls Sharia is oppressive, unjust, and a betrayal of the tradition's own principles, and I refuse to accept it as authentic Sharia, that is not a rejection of the divine law. That is a rejection of a particular political implementation, one that may be deeply and catastrophically divorced from what classical scholars actually taught and required. Many of the things done in the name of Sharia by modern states would have been condemned by the classical jurists themselves. Anyway, the bottom line is the distinction between Sharia as divine ideal and fiqh as human interpretation is not merely academic. It is the key to understanding what can and cannot be challenged, what can and cannot be reformed, and what it means to be faithful to the tradition in the complexity of modern life. The Quran asks a question that was directed at the people of the book who had preceded the Muslim community, but whose relevance extends to every community in every age. Do you believe in part of the book and disbelieve in part? This is not a rhetorical device without application. It is a warning about a very human tendency that the Muslim community is not immune to. When Muslims follow some parts of Deen and ignore others, several things happen simultaneously. Hypocrisy emerges, the gap between what is preached and what is practiced becomes visible, and it corrodes the integrity of the witness Muslims offer to the world. Distortion follows. When individuals and communities get to choose which parts of Deen are convenient to observe, the result is not a personalized faith but a self-serving one. Coherence is lost. The different parts of Deen are interconnected in ways that cannot be arbitrarily unpicked without weakening the whole structure. A Muslim who performs 5 daily prayers with meticulous care but conducts business through deception has not found a balance. They have created a fracture in their Deen that the tradition itself condemns. A Muslim who fasts through Ramadan but never fulfills the obligation of zakat has honored one pillar and neglected another. A Muslim who follows Shariah's requirements in their marriage contract but ignores its requirements in their financial dealings has created an inconsistency that cannot be theologically justified. Now the question arises, is perfect consistency possible? And the answer is no. No human being can follow the Deen with complete consistency and perfection. We all fall short. We all have areas of weakness, areas of struggle, areas where the gap between our ideals and our practice is painfully wide. This is part of what it means to be human, and the tradition has always known this. which is why repentance, the turning back to Allah, is one of the most central acts in Islamic spiritual life. But there is an important difference between struggling to obey and deciding that certain commands are no longer relevant. Between falling short and deliberately selecting which portions of the tradition to honor. The first is the condition of every sincere believer. The second is what the Quran warns against. The goal is not perfection, it is sincere effort, honest acknowledgement of failure, and continual return. We cannot ignore this reality. For many people, particularly women, religious minorities, and political dissidents in countries that claim to implement Sharia, the lived reality has been, and continues to be, genuinely oppressive. To dismiss their experience by invoking the beauty of the classical tradition is both intellectually dishonest and morally inadequate. The patterns of harm are specific and documented, punishments applied harshly to the poor and vulnerable while the powerful and connected escape accountability. Confessions extracted under torture and accepted as evidence. An absence of proper legal representation and meaningful appeals processes. Interpretations of family law that restrict women's movement, discount their testimony, and limit their agency. Persecution of religious minorities, Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan, Christians in parts of the Arab world, Shia Muslims in certain Sunni-majority countries, on the basis of belief. The weaponization of religious law by governments to suppress dissent, intimidate opponents, and maintain authoritarian control. When this is the reality you have lived, it is entirely understandable and entirely rational to see Sharia as a system of oppression. Some people, facing this reality, turn away from Islam entirely. The tragedy is that the classical jurists themselves would be horrified by much of what is done in their name. The tradition they built insisted on due process and presumption of innocence. It required evidentiary standards so stringent that false conviction became extremely difficult. It demanded the right to proper legal representation. It established explicit protections for religious minorities, who were to live under the protection of the Muslim state with their own legal autonomy preserved. It placed mercy and forgiveness above punishment, and made clear that the spirit of the law was the protection of people, not their suffering. The gap between what the classical tradition required and what modern states claiming to implement Sharia actually do is not a small gap. It is a chasm. What is called Sharia in many contexts today would be unrecognizable to Ibn Hanbal, Al-Shafi'i, Imam Malik, or Imam Abu Hanifa, the great scholars in whose name these rulings are often justified. For those who see Sharia as oppression, the proper response is not to deny what they have experienced, and not to respond with defensive apologetics that minimize real harm. The proper response is to acknowledge the abuses honestly, to distinguish clearly between authentic Sharia and its corrupt, politicized, and decontextualized implementations, to work actively for reform rather than either defending the indefensible or abandoning the tradition entirely, and to demonstrate, through the quality of one's own actions and the depth of one's own engagement with the tradition, that Sharia at its best is a system of justice and mercy, not a tool of domination. Now, a historical question raises, did the Prophet Muhammad distinguish between Deen and Shari'ah in the way that later scholars, and we today, tend to do? Did he present them as two separate categories, one spiritual and one legal, that need to be brought together? The honest answer is, not quite. The conceptual distinction between Deen as the broad way of life and Sharia as its legal dimension developed as Islamic civilization grew and scholars needed precise vocabulary for the enterprise of jurisprudence. The word Sharia in the technical sense of Islamic law is not used frequently in the Quran in that precise technical way. What the Quran says is something like, He has ordained for you of the Deen what He enjoined upon Noah and what we have revealed to you and what we enjoined upon Abraham and Moses and Jesus. Here, the idea of divine ordination, of Allah establishing a path, is present, but the primary framing is Deen, with the legal dimension as one expression of it. The Prophet did not come to his community saying, "I bring you a spiritual Deen, and separately, a legal Sharia." He brought a unified message, belief in one God expressed in worship, embodied in ethics, structured through law, and lived in every dimension of existence simultaneously. The scholars who later developed the specialized vocabulary of Sharia and fiqh were naming and systematizing what was already unified in the prophetic teaching, not creating a new separation. This historical perspective has practical significance. When Muslims today say, "I follow the Deen but not the Sharia," they are attempting a separation that the Prophet never envisioned and that the tradition does not support. The Deen the Prophet brought includes Sharia, not as a foreign imposition but as its natural legal expression. You cannot have one without the other. At the same time, one can acknowledge that following Sharia as a legal system is only one dimension of the total Deen, and that the personal Deen of a believer extends far beyond mere legal compliance into spirituality, character, relationships, and the quality of one's inner life. Legal compliance without spiritual depth is not the Deen the Prophet modeled. Spiritual depth without legal seriousness is also not the Deen he modeled. Both together, that is what the Prophet brought. The first requirement for balance is the recovery of the full, holistic understanding of Deen that has been obscured by centuries of reduction. Deen is not just Sharia. It is also the cultivation of a spiritual life that brings one genuinely close to Allah. It is the development of ethical character that makes one a trustworthy, just, and compassionate member of human society. It is personal development, family values, social responsibility, and intellectual engagement with the world. A Muslim who knows every ruling of halal meat but lacks compassion for the poor has not mastered the Deen. They have mastered a small part of it while missing something essential. Second, Sharia must be continually recentered on its own stated objectives, justice, mercy, and the protection of human dignity. The Prophet said, "The most beloved of people to Allah are those who are most beneficial to others." This principle is not peripheral, it is central. Any implementation of Sharia that harms people, violates their dignity, or produces outcomes the opposite of justice and mercy is not true Sharia, whatever its proponents claim. Concretely, this means, hudud punishments should be the absolute last resort, applied only after all alternatives have been exhausted and only with the full weight of rigorous evidentiary standards that the tradition itself requires. Mercy and forgiveness should be the default, not punishment. Procedural protections, presumption of innocence, the right to proper representation, freedom from coerced confession, must be inviolable. Third, the objectives of Sharia can be pursued through different mechanisms in different contexts. The goal of protecting religion might be achieved in a modern democratic context through robust anti-hate speech protections and laws that prevent religious coercion, not through punishments for apostasy. The goal of protecting life might be achieved through effective policing, quality healthcare, and social safety nets, not only through the law of retaliation. The goal of protecting property might be achieved through anti-corruption legislation, transparent financial regulation, and accessible courts, not only through the hudud punishment for theft. The classical tradition understood this. When circumstances changed, rulings changed. Umar ibn al-Khattab suspended the punishment for theft during the year of famine, not because the principle had been abandoned, but because applying it in those circumstances would have served the opposite of its intended purpose. Any system that claims to implement Sharia must also embody Sharia's own insistence that no human being is infallible. Classical Islamic political theory recognized the right of the community to hold rulers accountable, and even to remove them if they violated the principles they were appointed to uphold. Modern institutions, independent judiciaries, meaningful separation of powers, genuine mechanisms for citizens to challenge state authority, are not foreign imports to be resisted. They are expressions of principles that the classical tradition itself affirmed. Classical Sharia distinguished between Muslim citizens and dhimmi, protected non-Muslim, communities in ways that made sense within the framework of pre-modern polities but that are contested in the context of modern nation-states with their own social contracts of equal citizenship. Many contemporary scholars argue that the Quranic command to deal justly with those who do not fight you for your faith and do not drive you from your homes is the fundamental guiding principle, and that equal citizenship for all, regardless of faith, is the contemporary expression of that principle. For most Muslims living in non-Muslim majority societies, the most practical balance involves something like this: follow Sharia personally in worship, ethics, family life, and business dealings, as fully as you can within the legal framework of your country. Advocate in the public sphere for the values of justice and mercy that Sharia enshrines. Recognize that a genuinely just society can emerge from different legal systems, as long as those systems protect the fundamental objectives that Sharia has always claimed as its own. And do not conflate the personal practice of Deen with the political demand for state enforcement of every Sharia ruling. Finally, the door of independent legal reasoning, ijtihad, must be opened wide and kept open. Scholars trained in the depth of classical jurisprudence and also equipped to engage with the realities of modern life must continue the work of issuing serious, well-grounded rulings on questions the classical scholars never faced: the ethics of organ donation, genetic modification, and end-of-life decisions, the Sharia compliance of new financial instruments including cryptocurrency, family law in contexts of domestic violence, contested custody, and changing family structures, the standards of evidence in an age of DNA profiling, digital forensics, and surveillance technology. Without ijtihad, Sharia becomes a museum exhibit, preserved and observed, but unable to speak to the actual conditions of actual people's lives. With ijtihad, it remains what it always was, a living tradition, anchored in revelation, growing through the disciplined intellectual effort of scholars committed to both faithfulness and relevance. We began with a question: what is the difference between Deen and Sharia? And we have found that the difference is not merely semantic or academic. It is the difference between a forest and a single tree, between a complete and all-encompassing way of life and the legal framework that is one dimension of that life, between the vast mercy and wisdom of the divine and the specific rulings that human scholars have worked across centuries to derive from that divine source. When we confuse the two, we end up with a distorted Islam, either a cold, harsh legalism without heart or spiritual depth, or a warm but weightless spirituality without structure or consequence. Neither of these is what the Prophet brought. He brought something that held both together without sacrificing either. When we separate them artificially, imagining that we can have the Deen without its legal expression, or that Sharia is somehow the whole of the Deen rather than one of its dimensions, we make a different kind of mistake. We cut the law from its spiritual roots, or we imagine we can have the spirit without the structure. The tradition has always known that this does not work. The authentic path is integration. Deen without Sharia is rudderless, full of feeling but without the structure that allows that feeling to become justice in the world. Sharia without the Deen that grounds and animates it is soulless, legally precise but spiritually empty, capable of producing compliance but not the character that gives compliance its meaning. The first key lesson is that Deen is the whole, the complete vision of a human life lived in submission to Allah, encompassing belief, worship, ethics, law, personal development, social responsibility, and political engagement. Nothing falls outside its scope. The second key lesson is that Sharia is one dimension of Deen, specifically, its legal dimension. It is important, it is divinely grounded, and it cannot be discarded. But it is not the whole, and treating it as the whole produces distortions that the tradition cannot sustain. The third key lesson is that fiqh, the human understanding of Sharia, has always evolved and always been diverse. The flexibility is not a weakness, it is a strength that allows the tradition to serve human beings in every time and place. What is fixed is the divine source. What has always adapted is the human engagement with that source. The fourth key lesson is that Deen over Dunya is not a call to abandon the world, but a call to hold it in its proper relationship to Allah, to engage fully with it while keeping the heart anchored in what is eternal rather than what is temporary. And the fifth and perhaps most important lesson is this: the challenge facing Muslims today is not to choose between Deen and Sharia, nor to defend either uncritically, but to understand both with honesty and depth, to apply both with wisdom and humility, and to embody both in a world that relentlessly seeks to reduce everything complex to something simple enough to dismiss. For those outside the tradition, the invitation is to resist those same reductions, to see, in the tradition's own terms, what it actually claims to be and to judge it by its best expressions rather than its worst ones. The path to water, the literal meaning of Sharia, leads to life. And the Deen, in its fullness, is the orientation of an entire life toward the source of all life. Together, they are inseparable. And that is the difference that makes all the difference. And Allah knows best.
you.